For me personally, I started out my running journey focusing on a pretty typical endurance athlete's diet, which is usually skewing towards moderate high carbohydrate. And that worked well for me when I was running in college and even for a couple of years after that. Once I got an ultra marathon, I one off season decided to try a lower carbohydrate approach just to see how I would respond to that. And that worked really well for me. So I've sort of stuck to that for I started employing that in 2011, so I guess it's coming up on 14 years of that sort of approach where I'm not strict ketogenic or anything like that. But if you look at kind of my macronutrients, it's going to skew a little higher to fat as the primary macronutrient, and then carbs and protein are going to be the lower of the three. And what that has done for me is it allows me on race day to leverage higher fat oxidation rates. So when I'm out there racing, that carbohydrate need side of the equation is a little lower. So like logistically, I just won't need as many carbohydrates as I would if I were following a moderate or higher carbohydrate diet.
So on a race day, would you would like if you were tested with like a finger prick, would you be in deep ketosis during a run, or do you kind of stay on the threshold there?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to know like what level of ketone bodies I'd be producing. I'm sure I'm producing like a decent amount or some anyway. Uh, I haven't ever actually tested that live. I've been part of tests that have looked into that, and I would at least be at like an entry point of ketosis for a run or something that was kind of at a lower intensity, like aerobic threshold or below. Um, the thing that I think is more important though is whatever, because it's not quite as clean as like, I mean, directionally, the higher your ketone bodies are, the more fat you're likely oxidizing. But the more important figure from like a race day standpoint is going to be where your fat oxidation rates at the intensity that you're going. So like if I went in, or what I've done in the past is I've gone in and gotten a metabolic cart test done. And so that aerobic threshold number that typically would leverage about a 50-50 split, for me, that's closer to like 80 to 90% fat, 10 to 20% carbohydrate. So if I look at like my fastest 100 miler where I was averaging about 9 miles per hour, I know my workload for that race is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,000 calories. So if I just use that equation of 10 to 20% of that's going to be coming from carbohydrate at that intensity, then I can start to kind of piece together like what my carbohydrate demands will be for that event and then sort of target that. So what I usually do is just kind of drip in through my hydration or any sort of exogenous carbohydrate source to try to hit that number. So for me, that's usually somewhere between like 30 or 40 grams per hour. If it's something like a 100-mile race.
And did the effect, like those carbs, then when you do drip them in, did you feel as you became more fat adapted, was the utilization more efficient? Or and I guess that's more of a subjective thing. Did you notice a difference in the way that when you did introduce those, then how your body received those?
Yeah, my first impression back when I kind of switched over was I had been doing races for, I think I'd done 4 or 5 ultra marathons at that time. And my experience was like I would take in quite a bit of carbohydrate, like 80 plus grams. And you notice the benefit of those when you would do that. When I kind of went and did a reverse and went lower carbohydrate and then started practicing fueling after that, it felt just like a little more sharp. So like if I took like half of what I would before, I would feel like I got the same response as I would from a full one, or a full amount. So like a lot of these endurance races will be using like these like carbohydrate gel packs, which are about 100 calories each. So what I would notice is I would get away with maybe a third or a fifth or a third or half of one of those for the same sort of result. And the other thing too is like the kind of the peaks and valleys of that experience where you're kind of chasing that sort of, okay, I want to stay focused, I want to stay consistent, and there's going to be parts where you feel better and worse. That kind of trend sort of to flatten a little bit more. So I was just like a little less susceptible to feel like I was like shot out of a cannon or like really in the depths, which I really liked. That just felt a little more predictable and a little more consistent experience to be able to count on.
Well, that's fascinating. I would have never thought in your world, doing a more fat based approach. Yeah, I get the science behind it. I know a lot of people do that, but I figured for like endurance, it'd be carbs, carbs, carbs. But it seems like that, like the way you've put it, that gives you a little bit of an edge. And is that common? Like, or are you a little bit of an outlier there with the reliance on fats versus carbs, because if you're burning them less and you can run longer, I mean that's got to be a huge advantage on a 100-mile race.
Yeah, the way I always look at it is whether you do a strategy like mine or you do a higher carbohydrate strategy, there's going to be pros and cons to both of them. And really what it comes down to is kind of understanding what those are and then backing up and looking at what is it showing for me at an individual level in terms of how I'm weighing these pros and cons and coming out at a net better endpoint than I would with the other approach, which can be difficult to do. But people sometimes have histories and experiences that maybe lend themselves one way or the other towards it. So I'm definitely in the minority. There's not a lot of runners that are doing a lower carbohydrate approach compared to doing a higher. In fact, right now there's like a big movement of like hyper carbohydrate fueling where we're seeing guys get up to like 130, 140, 150 grams of carbohydrate per hour, which is like 3-4x what I'm taking in during some of these races, and they're doing awesome with it. So it's like some of it I think is trying to understand, like, for one, can you do that? Is that something you're going to want to train yourself up to be able to tolerate? If you can and get away with it, then maybe there's an advantage there. If you can't, if you find yourself in a situation where like your big hurdle in training and racing is being able to digestively tolerate taking in that much refined carbohydrate, engineered fuel products, and things like that, those are the folks that I find tend to do a little bit better on a lower carbohydrate diet because they get a similar experience that I did, where now all of a sudden what they had to fuel with in the past comes down and it's just a little more manageable for them. And then you get people like a lot of my coaching clients who they want to do well at the race. They want to optimize their performance as best they can, but they're just as interested in health and, creating a consistent dietary pattern for them that works. And for a lot of the folks that come to me with the mindset of, okay, I'd rather stay low carbohydrate because that's worked for me for lifestyle things in terms of just consistency in their nutrition. They're not going to go high carbohydrate just for this race in order to try to leverage some of the maybe benefits from that side of things. They'd be more inclined to say, okay, this is the lifestyle I like. This is the nutrition plan that works for me. Let's fuel accordingly for this race and do it that way.